And then we will. We are beginning our little broadcast. Eventually there will be sound for this, but we still have to find a way to do bandwidth enough. Oh, the sounds of typewriters and telephone dials. Remember when telephones had dials and alarm clocks? And there is the wonderful Troubles in Paradise, tortugan.wordpress.com. Way off my damn auto die. My bad. Oh, shit. God. There we go. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. My bad. I forgot to mute my video on the other end. We're getting feedback there. That's what happens when you have somebody who doesn't always know what the hell I'm doing. Okay. I was listening to a video earlier in the day, and there's our little logo. Get rid of that. Okay, here we are. Clumsy, clumsy. So I'm an oaf. Anyway, this is our next evolution hour. Cap is here. Jackson hopefully will be coming in for some show and tell later on. He's had some awkward problems there in Louisiana. It was raining storm here in Spokane, and we either attribute it to natural climate cycles or demons. So we have several possibilities to work from. But anyway, what I've got going here is, and I accidentally hit the wrong menu and something's popping up when it shouldn't. Never get to be 65-year-old in a time when the technology has advanced to the point where you feel like you're from the 19th century and you're trying to explain buggy whips to people. I'm still very new at this. Anyway, the main core of this is the contested bonus book by Christopher Ruppy and John Sanford. John Sanford is a creationist geneticist, and yes, there are creationist geneticists. He doesn't seem to do much in the way of actual genetics, but that's a side story. Anyway, the book is on human evolution and how it ain't any human evolution, and it's an interesting analysis that I've been trying to show how source methods approach works in analyzing any kind of a document, and how it specifically is really handy for demolishing woo in the case of creationism or any topic. And as people who know me from Sci Strikes movie nights, it works just as easily on anti-vaxxers or flat earthers or anywhere else. And that is, you can make any claim you want, but where are you getting your sources from, and how did you check that they were accurate? And what we've got with Ruppy is that he's a dogmatist who wants evolution not to be true, and he hunts around, scavenges stuff. Often, I suspect, reading creationist literature and scavenging the sources the creationist literature mentioned. There was a little fellow, Mr. Brown, who's been haunting a lot of the earlier episodes in the comments section on YouTube. If you go back, I don't delete anything, so you can follow the stuff. I think the first video and just the most recent video, he and I have been jousting back and forth on, and I've been trying to remind him that no, if you get Ruppy and Sanford's book and simply copy the arguments from it, it's not explaining anything. All you're doing is repeating somebody else's tropes. And I've been trying to nudge him in vain to start looking at primary source thing and try to establish whether stuff is true. As you've noticed from the earlier discussions, most of the mistakes that go on in anti-evolution apologetics has to do with parsing quotes very carefully. It's the text string is accurate, but it's taken out of context, so you don't really know what the whole context is. And there may be additional data that's the reason why they phrased it the way they did that now bears upon the point at issue. That happens a lot, and it's already happened with Ruppy. But in the case of Ruppy, this time we got a much more interesting example. It's relatively rare. Cap was saying that how surprised I ought to have been about this, but I'm going, no, actually, this is an unusual thing. And that is a quote that doesn't exist at all. The fellow in Chapter 4 on Homo erectus, they say, as psychologist Willerman and colleagues have noted in the journal Intelligence, quote, and they italicize this entire quote, there is no strong direct relationship between brain size and intelligence among modern humans, unquote. And they refer to this 1991 article, and I put the link to the abstract of it up on the video description. I was able to get the full text personally by means surreptitious that I won't go into, but nevertheless, I didn't put a link up to that because it wasn't readily accessible to everybody. So you can ferret around on your own. But the main point is that the abstract itself explicitly says the opposite of what the quote just said, which means that they actually do argue that there was a relationship between brain size and intelligence, bearing in mind intelligence is the ability to take an intelligence test. And so there's quibbles about that. Their main point was that when you take into account scale, so little people will have probably smaller brain sizes proportionally than larger people. And so you have to measure that proportionality to see and that by and large, there seems to be a suggestive correlation between intelligence as measured by the intelligence tests and overall brain size when adjusted for body size. Not what they just said was the quote, but worse, that quote is nowhere in their paper. They simply didn't say it at all. And in fact, I Googled the quote to see, did anybody ever say it? Is there anything in any creationist literature they could have copied? And I went several pages down the slot to try to see, and it wasn't showing up anywhere. So somebody may be able to find the quote at some later stage, and I may be able to identify that. But my suspicion is they wrote something down wrong, that they were reading something secondarily, that they were reading some source they misinterpreted, they got it associated somehow or other with this paper and ended up running off the gangplank with it. That's a sloppy. So we're going to be talking about brains today. And no zombie eating of brains, although we are going to talk about how the brain ought to be used and how creationists apparently make use of their brains and how intelligent designers apparently make use of their brains. And one of the, jump in there, Cap. You're going to make a bad joke, I know.
To the punchline. I was going to say, I was going to say brains. Wait, creationists, I'm going to starve.
Yes, brains. Yes, their brains. And in fact, the issue is about, for one thing, even though they seem to know that there is no overall correlation between mere brain size, its relation to body mass and what the brain is consisting of, how the sections are put together, what sections are dominant more, how many convolutions there are. There's a whole bunch of issues that pop up in there. And they seem to be vaguely aware of that, but they don't do anything with it. And instead, they spent pages focusing on the fact that Homo erectus brain, the larger examples of Homo erectus towards the tail end of the thing are falling within the range of the bottom end of the human range. And so, ta-da, Homo erectus is just normal people. Well, they're almost normal people. And the one that popped up, that was an interesting one that I thought I would bring up as a historical example, has to do with Anatole France's brain. You're probably all too young to remember or pay any attention to Anatole France, who was a genius writer in the 19th century. I think he died in the 1920s. He got a Nobel Prize for his stuff, for his literature. And he was a little teeny guy with apparently a brain to match. A relatively small brain size. It was only like 800 milliliters, something like that. That puts him at the bottom end of the range for typical human beings. And they were trotting this out. They listed this Scoils analysis, which was a perfectly fine discussion on various brain elements. And what was really intriguing about it is then they talked about this other guy that was apparently perfectly normal, but with a very small brain, this guy Lyon, that Scoils also had mentioned him, but yet for some weird reason, Rupi and Sanford decided to cite a creationist source for this blip of information, even though they had just cited somebody that had discussed it. So I was always intrigued by why they were jumping from one thing to another. Anyway, I found out about the case of Anatole France's brain. There was only one analysis that was done on it by some Frenchmen at the time after he died. And it was alluded to by Sir Arthur Keith. And I put the link up to this. So here's some history, you see. I thought it would be fun to put up something from 1927, a time when Lindbergh was flying the Atlantic and there were crystal set radios and you still had to crank cars occasionally. And there was no television yet. And all of the kinds of things that we're used to, let alone portable cell phones and that. It was a very different world. And Keith figured in the kind of, British superior Piltdown, all of that wonderful pip-pip Arthur Treacher form of anthropology at the time. There was a little bit of British smugness about him, as he acknowledged that Anatole France was a genius, but a rather primitive man, and this small brain kind of proves it. So I put the link up to that so that you can kind of read a bit to jump back into a different world and give you a sense about what some paleoanthropologists were doing back before modern paleoanthropology was developed. in an era where they didn't know about DNA, and they didn't know about homeobox genes, and they didn't have MRIs and all the kinds of things that we make use of today to do analysis on it. And then also a link to Christoph Koch, who is not from the 1920s. He's a contemporary neuroscientist, and he's a major one in the field. And there's a wonderful little article that also discusses Anatole France's brains, as well as the brains of primates and mammals in general, and all over this issue of to what extent does mere brain size relate to intelligence or not. So that will give you a bit of a perspective on not merely the creationist side of things, but also a view of what the scientific view was a long time ago and what the scientific view is now, and you'll be able to get kind of a little perspective on that. So I thought those would be kind of fun historical things, because I love the history of it, and it's important to have a sense of the history of the science. Because if you think that everything has been the way it is now, you can't deal sometimes with creationists that are riffing off of stuff like Piltdown that gets used over and over and over again. And if you don't know the background context, the social context, the prejudices and attitudes that people had, and what happened later and how we moved beyond all of that and why, you might not make as effective a counter argument. So Jackson isn't here to make a little comment on that, but Cap is, that you can make an observation about, from your own experience and background, bumping into creationists and viewpoints over the years. Was human intelligence much of an issue? Did they really think a heck of a lot about it?
No. Wait. You're implying they actually have intelligence to think. I mean, I think.
Well, no, because you bumped into, they come from a background where creationism was something that you were aware of from inside out. And so to the extent of what you knew or didn't in terms of how their perception was, I've always had a particular secular framework. So I'm looking at the science literature and the science arguments, and only then coming after the fact into the mindset of the anti-evolutionist. But you might give a little bit different perspective on it than what I would have.
On like how human intelligence was always viewed, that it came because God gave us the intelligence. That's always, it's never really, evolution was never supposed to be true, and it's just all this stuff. And it's, I don't know if I ever really, I mean, I was brought up in it, but I don't know if I ever really bought it so much, because every time I would learn something new through school and asking the questions that I would ask, it's just the more things started to just unravel on the creationist side. And it's just,
that experience doesn't surprise me, because anti-evolutionists are really uninterested in neuroscience. And this is one of the things that I've been discovering in the long-term bit, is how little of that neuroscience data is showing up in their discussions of things. And already in the Rupi and Samford book, where they're bumping into the issue of what makes this little meat computer up here do stuff. And how has it changed over time? And has it changed over time? And if there has been an evolutionary process, how can you trace the variations and developments over time? And I made a big deal in the previous episodes about the fact that Rupi, who is the main point man for the book, has been really slow to look at the niggling details of what the brain stuff was. The last episode, I put up a chart that was literally under his own eyeballs, because it was in a source he cited. And yet they weren't mentioning any of these details about what brain systems were involved in what, and how we can track the development of these things in the brain endocasts.
Yeah, I want to point out something from the chat. David Lass: human intelligence is limited. Human stupidity is infinite. Set your expectations accordingly.
Oh, yes, indeed, David Lass. Yes.
With that.
I will not disagree with that either. That it's much harder. For one thing, it's easy to be stupid because it's lazy.
Yeah.
You can come up with a prejudice that you want to be true. You can just say it, and maybe you can scavenge around for somebody that agrees with you. But figuring out what is really true, which is why science is harder than stupid, because you've now got to say, okay, what is sufficient evidence for this position? How much evidence actually exists? If you have a limited range of evidence, as we have in the case of the fossil record, where you have a little scatter here and a little bit here and a little bit there, that you have to figure out what you can infer from that reasonably and what not, how to make predictions on the basis of it. So that's why science is harder than stupid. And it's probably why more people do stupid than science.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's because like I said, I know with me back, because I was never a young earth creationist ever. Even though I was brought up Fundy Southern Baptist, or I was technically more Fundy Lutheran, but I aligned more with the Southern Baptist. But I remember, like I said, in third grade, third grade, sit there and think who was my teacher, Miss Krubel.
Good heavens, you can remember their names. You're better than me.
Yeah, Miss Krubel was. She talked on dinosaurs about how they lived millions of years ago, and I was just curious. So I asked. I said, "How do we know that? I mean, humans haven't been around for over 1 million years, and I knew that much." And she goes, "Well, here's how." And she talked on radiometric dating, and the way a third grader could. She could go, "Well, you have argon, and when it has half of this, it becomes." Remember she said it was like potassium, or it was one of them, and that becomes that. And so half of whatever
Peter is joined. Yeah,
would
that's very impressive, because she was not talking down to you.
No.
She was trying to frame it in a way that was understood. That's an excellent piece of education, because she felt that you were entitled to know the actual science.
Because to me, it was, because I thought it was a valid question. I'm like, because I didn't know. I'm like, well, how do we know this? I want to know. I would be as smart as the scientists.
Yeah,
which I
you
know
gave
is
an
very
excellent
much
question, and she gave a very good answer.
Yes.
I got to pop in here with Brian G. from the live chat, who said he was in YEC, Young Earth Creationism, and says Kent Hovind was considered cutting edge. That's
which lines up with why I joined, because you made a horrific mistake.
Did I?
Yeah. You asked Cap Brony about human intelligence. That's pretty much the equivalent of asking a creationist how to do science.
I know. Well, we keep Cap here for comic relief, but he does have a different background than I have, and the same way others. When we had activist on the program last week, that was also extremely useful, because I don't come from that religious frame where I bumped into this directly. I've always been from a secular background, and so I've studied an awful lot about it. But there's nothing like somebody who's in that perspective, who has left it, because they can tell you insights about what was going on in their minds, what things were important, what things were discussed, what things weren't. That's a direct measurement that I find very, very useful.
Yeah, I fully agree. But I love that you said that he's here for comic relief. I'm going to mess with him a lot about.
I'll stop. We set low expectations for Cap and intend for him to not make them.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Anyway, the next part of the show, and I want to leave enough here just in case Jackson was thrown out, and I wanted to talk because he had bought a copy of the latest Answers book, and we were going to have a little bit of discussion on that if possible. So I'll kind of get to the next stage, which is the wonderful world of the Discovery Institute and the gift that keeps on giving, David Klinghoffer. Klinghoffer is one of their point people, and he will often be the one who will be linking to, and Denise O'Leary and do these other things as well. I follow them on Twitter. Oh, how handy. Anyway, Klinghoffer will often link to Evolution News and Views posts, sometimes by him, sometimes by other people. And so I'm kind of getting heads up. If he thinks this is important, I am going to think it's important. I'm going to check it out, especially if it cites primary source technical literature. And as you know from many of these discussions on Evolution Hour, this will come as no shock. Anti-evolutionists are really keen on bringing up the Cambrian Explosion. Wow, they just love the Cambrian Explosion. And so here's yet another one where they try to feed off every debating issue about what was the cause of the explosion. Why was there in fact an explosion, or was this an artifact of the biology? My general view is that most of the phyla that are showing up in the Cambrian are indeed just showing up there. This is when we're just catching them, and it's largely a lot of arthropods. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a lot of evolution going on. And so I'm going to be preparing for my next little show and tell. I put the linkage up to the not only the Evolution News linkage, and also one of their own sublinks, because I'm going to be discussing that as well, but the two technical papers that were brought up, because I want you to be able to go and read them. They're both open access, so everybody can look at them. One was on the Ediacara Biota, and just in case you don't know what the hell that is, that about 70 million years or so before the big Cambrian explosion, you had a very different ecosystem with these weird little palm frondy things and some that look like bath mats crawling around, and there weren't any conventional buggy things yet. And they're not at all sure. In fact, the one article that you'll, if you go and read it, they call them the biota, not fauna, because we're not yet sure if all of them were like animals or not, or were they kind of plantish, or maybe a totally different structure that we're not at all used to. They're still uncertain. None of them exist now. They're all extinct. And so you can't look at anything, and they're so far back in terms of structure. They've got these strange five-fold symmetries and strange balances and stuff that we can't tell. Oh, Rational Mind on the side, did you see the paper that came out yesterday about euarthropods during the Cambrian early fossil record and the Cambrian explosion? Yes, in fact, the Discovery Institute was riffing off of that very thing. It's a head of print paper. They've got a posting on it. I can't remember, in fact, whether one of the ones that I put a link to discussed it or linked to it or not, but it's hasn't hit full print yet. So when it does, then I'll be adding it into the system, and everything in PNAS becomes open access after a year. So eventually I'll be able to analyze it. But by the euarthropods, it relates, if you're familiar at all with the Cambrian, you've got a bunch of little buggy things as the dominant groups. And by little, we're talking about like Morella, that's about the size of your fingernail. And then you've got other things that maybe would be ones that if you saw them crawling around in your hand, you'd go, then you've got a big jump up to the killer predator of the time, anomalocarids, that were these weird things that were anywhere from about 3 to 6 feet long. They were a fairly broad range group, at least along the equator, where we got all these loggerstatin to be able to tell. They were in tropical oceans, but they had these weird, like shrimp-like grasping things and this weird pineapple slice round mouth, but they're now regarded as part of that arthropod grouping that leads off into insects and that, because they've been making more and more strides on it. And so, yeah, that's a brand new paper. And of course, the intelligent design movement is going to be misrepresenting all of it. Yeah. So I'm about ready to give a nice little thing. So that on the Ediacara Biota, we don't have any of them to look at to tell. We only know the tracings. That none of the deposits are Lagerstätten class, so they're fuzzy by comparison to what we've got with the 3 Lagerstätten in the Cambrian, where you have much more detail to look at. So that makes it even harder to figure out what the hell they are. Some biologists are trying to retro-engineer with homeobox genes to try to figure out if they can figure out what kind of configuration of HOX genes would produce that kind of a system or not. That's paleogenomics at a very high level, so that's going to probably take quite a while. But one thing they have been able to do is try to figure out more about their ecology and how far they're spread all over the place. Now, the group that they're focusing on in the paper that I linked to is from Baltica, which is a part that eventually became part of like the Baltic part of Europe. But back then it was down in the southern hemisphere next to Laurasia and was probably an isolated island system. The climate was very different because they were just coming off of the hyperglaciation period, and there were very unusual stuff. Nothing was living up on the land at this time except maybe some bacteria. Oxygen levels were just now climbing, and that's the other issue. That boy, the Discovery Institute hates the discussion about the oxygen rise, because they're measuring how the idea being that these metazoans need oxygen as a fuel source. And so even though they've been around for quite a while before the big Cambrian explosion, they start extrapolating because oxygen levels are rising higher and higher, including up in the atmosphere, but they don't need to worry about that because they're not living up above the water. But the oxygen levels below, and the circulation patterns and the nutrient patterns and how bacteria are interacting, this is the ecological environment that paper is dealing with. And it's just a fascinating discussion of all the little ins and outs of stuff. And I think you'll find that the Discovery Institute's gloss on it is smug and superficial. For one thing, they say at one point that, well, they don't offer any explanations of where these come from. Well, it wasn't the purpose of the paper, A, and B, You don't explain where they came from either, now do you? The Discovery Institute doesn't offer an explanation for them. Are they claiming that there was a design event involved where all the Ediacara Biota designed all at once? We never get that. And we don't ever get that on any subject matter at all. But anyway, let me go into the Jimmy's going to try to screen share again mode. And let me get this thing. So as soon as we're into clickety-clack, okay, and there's the infinite regress, get rid of that. Now, hopefully you are now seeing a cute little chart with a big blob of pink and then some big blob of blue. And this is from that brand new paper in Nature Communications or Science Communications, Science Progress, whatever it is, in there. And you'll notice there's the Deuterostoma, the Echidzoa, the Lophotrochozoa, these are the most current terms for groupings. As you can see here, you got worms and us in the deuterostomes, and they were sampling 12 species, and another 12 for these ones that include worms and the arachnids and that, and then your mollusk group down in here, and your cnidarians, which would be jellyfish and placozoans and ctenophores and sponges, porifera, and farther back along here to choanoflagellates that are just at the baseline of metazoans, and way farther down into the catch-all outgroups, which would include plants and all of that. Now, what they have done is look at a bunch of gene clusters and to see what systems are being used and what ones aren't from the existing forms. Remember, trying to infer from that, from 500 million years, 1 billion years apart. And so what they discovered that although the Cambrian explosion seems explosiony, there's an awful lot about it that's not quite as big as you would think. That there are some new gene groupings popping up, but some of the fundamental things were actually taking place at the root of the metazoans. In other words, long before you're getting into the fun and games part. And for me, a nice little chart was on the next page where they were breaking things down by genetic systems. And the metazoans are in red in here. And you'll notice, whoa, nucleic acid binding systems certainly did a big change in this stem group before you get into the early metazoans. Transcription factor regulation, signaling molecules, receptors, transporters, farther down the road, hydrolases and enzyme. That hydrolase is one where you can see that the metazoans are clearly having much more variation since then than the metazoan split. And even in every category, you find that the metazoan at the very root are generating genetic systems and variations on genetic systems that are going to be playing out in much, much later things. So ironically, what we've got here is a spectacular case, stop sharing, a spectacular case of refuting, ironically, Steve Meyer, who's mentioned in the Discovery Institute post where they talk about that Steve Meyer's attitudes about this were so prescient. No, you're getting it all wrong. Meyer's argument is that there is some gigantic influx of information in the Cambrian explosion. And what this new analysis actually does is the opposite, that a hell of a lot of the air quotes information in the genetic systems were developed before the Cambrian explosion, had been knocking around probably for hundreds of millions of years in the precursor organisms that are eventually going to lead to the stuff that we see proliferating in new forms at the phyletic level, way farther down the road with the metazoan thing. They identified 25 group clusters of systems that were really unique to the metazoans. But unique does not mean didn't evolve from something else. And so I will expect that's probably going to be like an authority quote that some creationists are going to riff off of without looking into it. But I'm going to be keeping track of the details and the fiddly bits as to what they're talking about at the specific gene level. So I found that an absolutely fascinating paper. And hopefully a lot of you will actually go and download it. You can get the PDFs on it or HTMLs, however you want to look at it, and take a look at it. Because this is like the sciencey stuff. And look at the Discovery Institute's treatment of it to see how glib, how superficial, how useless all of it is. And then they just kept on going because they went off on this geology paper. And geology is not an area they usually deal much with. And here they started sounding suspiciously like young Earth creationists because they were saying about how that there was this deposit that this brand new paper, fortunately, it turned out to be open access, so you can read the whole thing, there was a kind of, when there's volcanic deposits, those deposits can come out in a big splurge. Then they can also be broken up by erosion, and then there can be like landslides that bring the parts into a thing in like a slurry, and it gets preserved as well. And so you've got these, I think there's a fancy little word for it that they've used in the paper, but they're different from sills, which are the direct volcanic spurt. There's still, in both of them are volcanic processes and the things that happen after volcanic processes. And the paper was very specific about that. And these smartasses at the Discovery Institute don't seem to realize that. And they're saying, well, you know, they're using all these unusual terms and that. And I looked that up and I didn't quite make sense out of that. And but it's definitely not a sill. All it was is that because I think they were riffing off the idea that there were dating issues and that they might have to redate some stuff. Well, duh. That if you thought a deposit was formed in a single go, your dating of it might be taken from one part, and the other one you might miss, not realizing that they were actually formed in separate things. And the landslide is taking place differently than the date the rocks were originally formed. And that in this particular case, it looks like there was like a billion-year-old thing for the actual volcanic stuff, but this slide part actually dates about 300 million years later. This is all Precambrian. And the thing is that in the paper, it explicitly said how hard it was to identify this difference, because they look so much alike that they literally said that the mistake that was made was completely understandable, that it would be very easy for the geologists to think that this was all in the same thing. And you had to look literally at the microscopic level to look at the crystal formations to realize that some of this stuff had been metamorphized and modified and that actually had not been in the same thing, and then date those separately so that you'd be able to figure out the sequencing of things and make these finer distinctions. And they'll probably have to go through in other deposits. So here was a case of science marching on, and the snark fest at the Discovery Institute trying to make hay out of this and saying, oh, well, see, there's more errors on their part. They can't date a damn thing. Comments, gentlemen?
Yeah, I have a question for you. So you mean science will admit when it makes mistakes and try and correct them? I mean,
intelligent design doesn't.
Yeah, and if I'm supposed to meet your low expectations of standard, I gotta ask this then, since we're talking about the Cambrian explosion. When has an explosion ever caused anything? I mean, if I blow up a car in a junkyard, it's not going to assemble into a 747.
Hey, we should start a new trope. We should say Cambrian explosion. Hell, do we see little tiny Morella parts thrown all over the place? There couldn't have been an explosion.
Yeah. I'm sorry. If I'm supposed to be the low IQ person here, I might as well live up to the job, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Old Scratch says Precambrian, like the graboids from Tremors. Ah, yeah, there we go.
What bugs me is that they keep coming up with something cannot come from nothing, and then come up with a god who made everything supposedly out of nothing.
Yeah,
and so, himself is from nothing. It's an uncaused cause. But that's, of course, that's origins or bust. David Last in the live chat says the Discovery Institute gives fewer dates than Jesus Christ did. That's true, because if there's one thing that if you read, they may only occasionally even bump into sequence. They don't think chronologically, and that's actually part of the problem. That you can see why they can muddle it up so much. That when the paper on the metazoan genes was explicitly talking about things that aren't happening all at once, they're existing in a time frame. Metazoans, sponges, and all the rest are predating the Cambrian by a long margin, but nobody at the Discovery Institute puts everything into a map of time sequence, ever. Yeah. And so the idea that you would try to create a mental map of what you think happened, if you want to be an intelligent designer and think that there was design events, go ahead. Make that case, but make sure that everything is in the proper geological sequence and every blip on the scope is correctly identified and all the available data is done, and then strut your stuff and tell us how design arguments make sense. But they don't get to that level. And
I think I can explain that, James. Mm-hmm. Because if they're going to put dates on everything, they're going to lose funding, because if they're going to adhere to an old Earth, they're going to lose all the young Earth creationists funding the Discovery Institute. If they're going to a young Earth dating system, they're going to lose the old Earth creationists.
Well,
they
I'll
can't
dispute
commit.
that one here.
They can't.
I
They
don't.
can't. They can't commit to either group without losing a part of their funding.
You got it part, but it's not the funding part. I don't know any strong evidence that the Discovery Institute depends very heavily on scratch from young Earth creationists. If you're a committed young Earth creationist, you're more likely to be funneling money to Ken Ham than you are to the Discovery Institute. They have bankrolls from the various collegiate types and the Amundsen Foundation and all of that that's been able to bankrupt them, and then they self-fund. Now, the area that you have hit on, though, that is relevant is that the Discovery Institute is not about funding, it's about message. That they want a message that's generic and universal. That a young Earth creationist can read a Steve Meyer book and not be thrown off because he really doesn't deal with chronology. So he never does anything that's going to make him go, uh-oh, you're not talking carnivorous dinosaurs here, are you? So they are very careful in framing everything to be generic. And most grassroots creationists are happy. They can smorgasbord pick stuff from the Discovery Institute, and they can pick stuff from Answers in Genesis, because they're never in conflict with one another. The only ones that you are tending to find are doctrinal will be your in-house Discovery Institute types that will always make sure that they're relying on Discovery Institute orbit stuff. Same thing with the material from Hugh Ross's bunch. He'll stay kind of in-house. And then young Earth creationists, because they're fusspots on the theology. So they don't trust anybody who accepts an old Earth. They may allude to Michael Behe, but they'll put caveats in the saying that he isn't really one of us because he doesn't believe the full 9 yards. And then the other thing in the room is the fact that he's a Roman Catholic, and most of your younger creationists are wacky Protestants.
Yeah,
not all.
Yeah, he's a Catholic. Oh well, that just tainted him. He's going to hell. I was going to point out something that Old Scratch said. It said, "I like when they say evolutionists think we came from rocks when they think we came from dirt."
Yeah, and or a ribectomy for women. That's an irony in there.
But there's also another problem with that, Cap, and I know you are a former theist, and I don't know if you ever thought of this, but so Christians tend to think that they're special.
Yeah.
So if we are so special, then why is everything in the universe created from nothing as something special, and to create man, he had to use dirt, and for a woman, a rib? Why aren't we special enough to be created from nothing as a unique species?
I can answer that. Because God he was actually trying to make a mud pie for Jesus. Jesus was making a mud pie and made the human, and God's like, all right, I'll bring it to life for you. And then the man got lonely, and he asked for a helper. And God said, well, I can give you a helper if you give me an arm. He's like, no, I kind of like my arms. I need to keep them. He goes, well, then I'll take one of your legs. And
we have, hold on. We have to qualify helper, because helper in the Bible actually means mate.
Yeah, you're
intended to.
You're ruining the joke.
There's going to be a lot of let me interrupt the point, because I'm about mid-rate here, so I'm going to put in my little screen share plug, and then we'll get back to the discussion of stuff here. And we got that in there. Okay, thank you. Here's all my patrons. We are actually a volunteer-funded operation here. I'm an old fart on Social Security trying to do the big fight on a budget that's non-existent. And anyway, thank you very much to the ones at the Patreon that have ponied up some stuff for the project. Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex Stone and Totis Real. I love saying that. And Everett and Paul. Thank you all. There's my website, my perpetual notion that you want to put that on your PC and on your smartphone and all the rest. I've tested it. I can access it on my smartphone too. And here's the Patreon site, although I will also obligatorily point out that they're slow as molasses on getting funding into it if you're a small potatoes person the way I am, and in some cases even not small potatoes. There's a bit of a quibble about that. So I recommend it as a more generic and quick and fast and fun way to help the project. If you are of a mind, the GoFundMe.com/Desigo, and I put a link to all of this fun and games in the links to the video. And so there is my can rattle for the show, and I've now stopped shared, and we can get on to the thing. You see, the whole bit about the Genesis origin story has to do with the fact that it's borrowed from a lot. There's a lot of older stuff. They picked up stuff from the Babylonians. They had stuff from their own religious traditions, of which it's murky as to exactly where a lot of that came from. A lot of the archangels may have been reflecting other demigods that got folded into stuff. We don't have a lot of primary sources to be able to ferret all of these things out about. But if you create things, you've only got elemental forces to work with. So you make stuff out of dirt. Animals and things, stuff seems to crawl out of stuff. You've got air, you've got fire. These are the kind of natural forces. You don't find a discussion in Genesis to, in the beginning was energy, and it turned into hadrons and leptons, and even if you translated it in, and you could phrase all of this stuff in ways that would have been intelligible to somebody in a pre-scientific age, but we don't find any examples of that. And then, if you think that Genesis is long, just to get to the meat of the Cecil B. DeMille moments, if you remove all the begats and the foreskin listings and all of that, imagine if they tried to have a text that described anything much about the history of the universe. I mean, that's going to be one long book. So it would make encyclopedia in there, but it would have been much more impressive if they had done that. So anyway, back on to the happy gangs of the Discovery Institute. One of the links that was in that chain that I put up on the sign had to do with a discussion of this notion, and I think I may have discussed in one of the earlier videos about this argument that's been put forward that the systems that generate cancers in modern organisms, the systems that do that are related to cell generation and cell growth, and that those systems may have been part of the thing that helped produce the Cambrian explosion. Discovery Institute routinely goes overboard in trying to pit theory A, hypothesis A against hypothesis B, as though they couldn't always happen at once. So they say, oh, the notion that the Cambrian was triggered by oxygen has been disputed by some people, and somebody else comes up with this theory instead. But that doesn't mean they can't all be happening at once. That's part of the issue. And in fact, it probably was a lot of factors all occurring layer by layer by layer that produced the effects we want. But along the way with this little fun and games, was a lamb-based at Darwinian medicine. Ooh, the Discovery Institute's pissed off about that. The idea that modern evolutionary thinkers have pointed out that medicine, the medical institutions, have really not dealt with evolution much. They were kind of the seat of the pants. This cell does that, and this stuff is made out of that, but not how it evolved. And that nowadays, though, when they're looking at epidemiology, the way they can look at viruses and the way they mutate, the way they can look at population genetics and to make how you apply antibiotics, that you have to pay attention to evolution, because if you use them the wrong way, you're going to make a selection pressure that's going to produce a superbug. And that's exactly what we're seeing in hospital contexts, that you have to use evolution theory to understand how animals adapt and organisms adapt in their environment, as well as the roots of them in terms of how certain diseases have come about because of the evolutionary history of the systems that are generating them. And therefore, you have to understand how you're going to intervene if you come in with the wrong kind of medicine, that it can bung up more because you're mistakenly misunderstanding how the thing evolved, and to realize how one thing is connected to another. So I put the link up to the paper on that because it's an interesting history of the medical community and how Pasteur and Darwin fit into the picture specifically, and as well as how evolutionary theory is increasingly being applied. And then you can compare that to the Discovery Institute snarking, and Jonathan Wells, who is a pseudoscientist on a monumental scale at the Discovery Institute. I've criticized him oodles in my work in various contexts, including in Evolution Slam Dunk. In fact, Christine Janis loved the part where I tore him and Dembski apart on the reptile mammal transition. She was gloating over that one. Anyway, that you can read his quotes and then read the article that they're connecting to at PLOS Biology and see what they've all left out, and decide if you want to leave your future of medicine in the hands of anybody. Do you want it in the hands of the people who've written the PLOS Biology argument, which, by the way, one of them is a medical researcher in the field. He's published a bunch of stuff on a variety of subjects. or Jonathan Wells, who is a minister at the Unification Church and misrepresents sources right and left and is a superficial Dwayne Gishian style pseudo scholar. I would recommend maybe you pay attention to the people who wrote the biology text. Comments? Responses?
I don't know. My brain just
brain fart.
Yeah.
Did you eating ice cream there?
No.
We have to go easy on Cap. His brain can't.
I had a comment, but I forgot what it was.
That seems to be becoming your shtick.
Yeah, I don't know why.
In every
keep a piece of paper handy and write down the details so that you can remind yourself, or have a Post-it note.
That earlier that I was going to comment on. You just recently said it. I cannot remember for the life of me what it was.
We'll have to ask. We'll have to ask James.
Keep an eye on the side chat, because often good points come up there. I want to answer questions that occur from that point always. So that's another point for you guys, that you can keep your eyeballs peeled on there, because when I go off on my rants here, I may not look over there to see what was going on.
James, yeah, you might want to do a show on a short memory loss. Maybe Cap could benefit from that.
Yeah, it'd be a sad thing, but yet he might forget to join it. So actually, we do have on a completely. If I was going to suddenly inject some science in here, what's interesting is it popped up in a discussion. I can't remember whether it was on a Science Friday or somewhere else, or maybe it was a side chat that I was looking at or listening to on a video. I can't even remember the context, but it was the issue of why do we tend to forget what we were doing when we enter a room. Everybody's done it. You're suddenly looking for something, and then you go into a room and suddenly you forgot what it is you came in there for.
Yeah.
It turns out there's a neurobiological mechanism for that.
Yeah.
But basically, when you enter a room, your brain is resetting the environment, and it basically knocks whatever was on the to-do list over one. And so now suddenly you're reconfiguring. Oh, Den, okay, there we go. And so that is actually, there's a neurobiological component to it that like you shouldn't be shocked. Or look at this thing that, jump in, Pat.
I was just saying, I think I could say why my brain is actually working. I'm only working off of one biscuits and gravy thing today. I have one biscuit with some gravy on it today. That's it. So
Brian Stevens said, I don't know whether this is a compliment or not. It is hard to put pictures in head fast enough to keep up with RJ. And he then noted the doorway effect.
I would fully agree with that. I would fully agree with that, because then we would have some kind of a strobe effect going on if we need to keep up with you talking. So
well, look at that thing over Laurel and Yanni, and everyone's having a conniption fit over it. It seems entirely logical. The neurobiological explanation is that young people hear higher frequencies than us old farts. And so it was not at all surprising that young people tend to hear Yanni, and old farts like me hear Laurel, because when you get into your 30s on, your ears naturally lose high-end frequencies. And if you have a sonic generator that has a series of acoustic waves in it that young people are hearing, their brain is selecting out those components, and it only takes about 50% of an auditory signal to generate things out of it. This is the reason why you can hear a conversation in a cocktail lounge where there's sounds going all over the place. And but yet the older brain is going to sample that other frequency range, and so you're literally hearing Laurel, and they're literally hearing Yanni. And because you don't hear things directly, you hear what your brain compiles for you that you then hear. It's a signal processing thing. We live in a matrix. It's a scary thought to realize it, that we don't perceive anything directly. We perceive what the brain has constructed as the movie in the brain, and the tactile sensations and smells and aromas and all the other stuff that's going on. And it's probably fairly similar from one person to the next, until you find out these things that it depends on what signals are being processed, and other areas where some of it's contingent upon what you had done before. For example, there's some intriguing studies that were done about language, where all humans start out with about the same acoustic range. But what happens is as you hear the language of your mother, it starts mapping you into particular clusters. And so the brain starts forming blobs of sound in the brain processing system, and they can physically see this in the way they do in the neuroimaging. And you eventually end up where certain sounds that are close together acoustically are lumped together, and you perceive them as a single unit. So that's why the Japanese literally can't tell the difference between L's and R's, where we can. Because we've mapped on our blob keeps them as separate, and their blob lumps them together in a different frame. Apparently, I guess it's the Swedes or the Norwegians, I think it was the Swedes, that has the most of the original vowel systems that occur in the natural acoustic map. They've had more of them as little separate blobs than any other language on Earth. And so all of those stupid little A's with circles on top and umlauts on letters that you don't think should ever have an umlaut, it's because they're literally hearing differences in there that they have to have a separate character for it, because they can hear the difference and we don't, because our blobs have lumped them all together. So there we go. There's a brief foray into language processing. Yeah, it's a fabulous field, and it's intriguing how little of this, while we're keeping on the brain theme, ever pops up in the anti-evolution literature. That they don't bother about the hardware. And if they're going to talk about why we have air quote souls, or where does our brain go at sleep? Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, Beej asked, would this explain why we can't understand other accents as well?
Oh, absolutely. You got it. That's nailed. Because we're trying to map, and especially when speaking at speed, because everybody talks fast, except for slow drawlers. But I mean, for all practical purposes, when people hear other people talk, you go, slow down, slow down. No, they're talking at the same rate you are. But you don't realize it because you're used to hearing a particular linguistic structure.
James, I have to jump in. That's not true. I mean, both Cap and I couldn't reach the speed of talk that you have. I mean, that's physically impossible.
I would need.
You're on 33 1/3, and I'm at 45 or 78.
Yeah, you're definitely at 78. But so is that because you're an old fart?
Oh, well, I've always been a fairly fast talker. And when I get revved up, I tend to speed up even more. So if I move too fast, say slow down, Jim, or better yet, pause for breath.
Although if that was accurate, then Cap and I should be on CD speed, which is a lot faster than 78. So
yeah, well, actually,
I think the analogy breaks down there.
The CD actually is a very useful analogy to bring up, because the typical CD player only samples the digital mix. That's one of the reasons why audio purists often bristle and they prefer records, because you're getting a direct analog thing as opposed to the digital. But theoretically, you can build, and some of the higher end CD players do, sample more of the digital to generate a more and more accurate waveform for its displays. But the average CD player that you're going to find in a car, or one that you carry around in there, for all of you ancient people from like 5 or 10 years ago that know about CDs as opposed to live streaming and all of the rest here. Yeah, there used to be these things called CDs that people would put into little players. And before that, there were great big CDs called records that you couldn't carry around at all. Although Chrysler actually tried to put a record player in one of their cars as an option. Go figure.
Although RJ, you're missing one. What about the cassette?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, an 8-track. There was another one. Yeah. Oh, David Last. I only have to quote him. The only person who spoke slowly, regularly, was Stevie from Malcolm in the Middle. So there's a homage to you, David. And it's uncomfortable for me to talk that slow.
Yeah. Hold on. And the two guys we covered on the last movie night.
Oh, God. Yeah, we spent about 1.5, and they still, it was like, is this normal speed still?
Oh, edgy emo atheist says CD isn't that old. Yeah, I know. In fact, that was they were starting to come in the mid 1980s, and then virtually overnight had blown records out of the water, although records still are being made. And we're finding that but there's also an interesting question about how long the discs will survive, and how long we deal with it. I have a huge CD collection behind me. In fact, I'm a monument to have acquired that. And one thing that was amazing about it, first of all, was the accessibility and the ease of putting more onto a thing. To give you, to walk back on the memory trail there, a Mahler symphony, for those of you who are aware of him, writes really long symphonies that run typically an hour or more. And I think the first version of the Mahler Second Symphony, which came out in the 45 era, back in like the 1930s or 40s, were on like 8 records because you had to have just a little section. They could only put a small amount of stuff on each one of them. And now, of course, you could put an entire Mahler symphony on a single side of a CD. Or the other bit, of course, is CDs and DVDs use the same technology. Here we're geeking out on you. Is there's multiple layers, so that you have a different layer underneath another, and so it can jump to the next layer. And that's why you'll find the spot in a DVD where about halfway through the movie, there's like a tiny fraction of a second where the movie pauses and then continues. That's because the laser is jumping to the next layer for the rest of the movie. You don't find that on Blu-rays because they have a different storage thing and they're using a finer laser point. So you have like Gone with the Wind 4 hours long on one disc.
and we need to because Cap just mentioned it, cassettes. You can only go back to cassettes if you start handing out pencils to people, and if you don't know what that means, then you might be too young.
It's an intriguing thing because one of the things about cassettes and 8-tracks is they are linear formats, and the same thing with some of the other things where a record would allow you to jump ahead. Theoretically, you could cue the record down wherever you wanted to. And of course, CDs and DVDs and all the rest could do the same thing. That's one of the reasons why VHS tapes and beta tapes were so inconvenient, because they were a linear format. In order to get to an hour into the movie, you got to fast forward the tape to an hour. Whereas a disc-based system, you can just electronically address any point on the disc.
No, I have to disagree, because I own a cassette player.
Yeah.
Which you can program. So I can put in a cassette and have it programmed to play the third track first, then skip and go to the 10th.
Yeah, but it still has to literally move the tape back and forth to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was the fatal problem with a format like that, because it was just too cumbersome to deal with. And then the other thing has to do with compression. Because the thing that was initially a problem for DVDs was that you had, in order to scrunch a movie down onto an hour disc, you had to, or 2-hour disc, you had to find a way of compressing the signal down to fit it into that little itty bitty thing. Whereas laser discs had more than enough space with those big clunky things to work with, using the same technology of laser. And the initial, for those who can remember to the ancient days of the late 1990s, that when DVDs first came out, they had a lot of compression problems. And so there were things where people would put their DVD on and there would look like transporter sprinkles at times, because the thing was just getting artifacts. And they very quickly figured out how to do that. And literally in just a couple of years, they figured out a new compression mechanism that suddenly made them just really good. And it was bye-bye Laserdisc.
Yeah, which brings me to a nice anecdote, because I used to organize dance evenings, and I was one of the first who introduced dancing on video clips. So back then we only had VCRs. So what I end up doing is the guy the DJ then had a couple of CD players that he could use, but he also had 3 video recorders. One to show the clip that the people were dancing on at that moment, one to have the next video clip ready for when the first one ran out, and a third one where he could constantly rewind or fast forward videotapes to get to the clip that was going to come up after that. And I can assure you that's a sure way to either drive someone completely crazy or get him to be
Yeah.
completely exhausted within an hour.
It's the equivalent of the lecturer with a stack of books on the lectern with a bunch of little bookmarks in them, and they got to remember in what order they're going to open them up and all the rest. It's exactly that clumsy.
Yeah. But you touched on the human brain and how it works. So there's also pattern seeking and expectations. So when you see something, you already make an expectation of what you are going to see, and that's something that magicians make fair use of.
Oh,
And
yeah.
being an amateur magician, it is so easy to trick people with just a sleight of hand, with just a tiny little trick, because they're
In
not
fact,
going
there's
to
a whole
they're not going
branch.
to look for it.
Whole branch of neuroscience now that pays attention to magic tricks and how the human beings preserve, how children and animals relate to a magic trick. And they're learning more about cognitive systems. For example, there's a thing where the expectations of persistence, that if you put a thing into a box and then you move the box over and lift the box away, you expect the thing to still be in it. And if it isn't, you get a kind of a, ooh, look, and you can find out at what level animals will still react oddly to things because they're seeing a violation of natural law in that kind of a structure. And then, of course, the whole magician trick things about how misdirection works, how your brain will be looking at things, the reason why you do the thing with one hand while somebody else does the other. All of these are actually telling us enormous things about how our brain pre-filters information, channels stuff in, and when you realize that it's not just when you're watching a magic trick that's happening, everything that you're perceiving, everything that you're looking at when you're meeting a person for the first time, and does the brain decide in advance prejudices about it based upon the hair, based upon the costume, and so all of those things that relate to our natural predilection for in-group, out-group, and all of that can have very deleterious effects, ultimately are building on some of the same dynamics circumstances that were occurring in relation to magic tricks, and presumably even going on in the brains going way back long before there was a David Copperfield.
Yeah. Well, the box thing is one of the things that I use quite a lot, because I'm a smoker. So people can now go bash me on Twitter and on YouTube that I need to quit smoking. But
yes, you just for your own health as well as, the fumigation of your clothes.
See what's what's coming up next won't be happening then anymore, because here in Holland you can't smoke within public buildings, so you have to go outside. So all the smokers are outside, and when it's time to go back in, what I usually do is take my burning cigarette, I make a fist, I press my burning cigarette in my fist, make sure that it's deep enough in there, and then open my hand to reveal that there's nothing there anymore.
And everyone goes, woo!
Yeah. First of all, because I take a burning cigarette and I put it in my hand without having on gloves or anything, and then when I extinguish the cigarette by pressing it hard enough into my fist with my fingers, then open my hand and the cigarette is gone. And that's the side
we're
of
over
people.
our hour now. I saw a comment from David Lass as I'm about ready to pull the plug on the show there. Did your first computer use vacuum tubes? And so that I'll just do a brief little thing that I'm reminded of the fact of how you go about making a computer and what the conceptual change was about the computer. It was partly hardware, but also conceptual. That yes, the earliest computers used tubes and stuff. That was basically what Turing built as a mechanism to decode the German codes and help win World War II back in the 40s. But the real great insight was the theoretical one. And that is that anything that can be described mathematically precisely can be modeled on a Turing machine. and that in principle you can make a Turing machine using water pipes and valves. You can use them almost any way you want to do, but they're going to be damn slow. And what it turned out was that if you can make the things that can switch on and off quickly, and that's why electronics matters, and better yet, do it without too much heat, and better yet, do it with a lot of things happening at once. And when you finally got into the integrated circuit, where you reached the stage where you were not only having little teeny, it's like it was more than just a miniature Turing machine, it was whole computers on a chip, to where in the space of just a microsecond, it's able to flip the things on and off. That if you tried to do that same process with piping and valves or steam engines, you could do it, but it would be the size of a city and be ridiculously slow. So it was the ability to do things at blinding speed that allows you then the software engineer figures out how you can describe anything. And it turns out little things like typewriting and pictures and movies and music and everything else can be described in a digital format. Ergo, they can be handled on a Turing machine. Ergo, you can do them on your computer. And then eventually you can make your computer portable. And so what's going to happen next? That within probably my lifetime, and you can see that I'm not a young kid, but still within my lifetime, if I can hang on for another 20 or 30 years, easily, everybody will have access to home devices, whether a personal walk-around computer or a home type, that is more powerful than the most powerful mainframe computer we can build today. And every one of those things is going to make information flow ultimately a terror for police states. And that's why the long term, after we're long past Donald Trump and Erdogan and all the others and Kim Jong-un, is the fact that everybody will have access to an array of information that travels at blinding speed. Presumably we don't create a race of robots that kill us, and allows us that there will always be ways around the firewall, which can be a bad thing for a good thing if you're a spy, bad thing if you're security. But at the same point, it makes it extremely difficult for police states to put a complete lid on information. And if the information can move, where, for example, you're trying to prevent the book from being known, and you don't realize that in the weather report signal that comes in, you can hitchhike 1,000 encyclopedias in a microsecond. How do you prevent against that?
Wasn't the first computer the Antikythera device?
In a way, yeah, that was the first predictor machine, or the first we know of. For those of you who didn't know about the Antikythera thing, and you can look up online and you can see videos on it and all that. It was an orrery that was about yay big. You could hold it in your hand. It wasn't very large. And it was a masterpiece of gearing that was designed to basically calculate the positions of the planets, and you could predict eclipses and all that. So it was a little portable astronomy thing done mechanically. And we still don't know much about the context of it. Who built it?
No.
For whom was it built? Was it for some geek scientist? It was found in a wreck. So obviously either its owner was taking it somewhere and the ship sank, or it was being shipped somewhere for some purpose. We don't know whether there was only that one, whether there were more than one, but none of them have survived. So there's a whole hidden network of science geekdom that is reflected in that object, which dates from, I think, 250. I can't remember until it was BC or AD. It was in Roman times. My memory is forgotten as to which one it is. But nevertheless, it's a deliciously tantalizing thing, and it was a remarkable thing. There's been articles on it in Scientific American. I think there's some books and stuff that have been done, because they literally did like a CAT scan of it, to where they were able to look at the corroded parts and reconstruct the gear ring, and that you wouldn't be able to do any other way. So the same technology that allows you to digitally reconstruct a squash skull that you find in a fossil bed without taking it out of its matrix. You don't even have to remove it from the rock. So there's, or in one case, they've done a thing where the fossil had been in terrible condition, but they have the casts and stuff of it. The information still exists, and they digitally reconstructed it, and then you could reconstruct, because of the way things get morphed, they were able to rebuild the original skull unsquashed that way. The technologies are absolutely wonderful that are being used, and for good or ill. So we have an exciting time ahead of us if we don't screw things up.
Correct. and what I like about the Antikythera device is that it opens up for all kinds of conspiracy theories because we don't know where it originated from. We don't know who made it. What we do know by now, due to the technology you just described, is that it's working. They have reconstructed it, and I think they're for sale even, because I've seen several different reconstructions of it.
Oh,
and
they've
we
even built
do
little
know it
sections of
works.
Babbage machines, which are really wonderful. We've gotten a wonderful stage of geekdom. And another thing too, there even it matters that when you think about how Edison made the original phonograph, we're spilling over the hour here. Sorry, gang. When they originally did the phonograph, what you have is a cylinder wrapped in tinfoil with a needle going on it, and it vibrates. And then if you put the needle back in and play the thing, you get the sound back. Not very good, but still in principle. And they realized that somebody, for example, who was using a clay instrument to make an incised line on a pottery thing, in effect was making a recording without realizing it. Not a very good one, but still theoretically a recording. And so there are ways of reconstructing things in the same way they have spy technology that can laser in on the window and you can hear what's going on inside because of the vibrations of the sound waves on there. Or even one, I think, where they were looking at a potato chip and using it as a reflector to be able to reconstruct the sound of the room by the inflections and vibrations on the. I mean, it's just unbelievable things that you can do, for good or ill, with the advanced technology, and it will only get more advanced. So as a culture, we've got to deal with these and figure out how to handle it. So I figured out. Here's the thing where I pull back to my original subject matter: is the tool that you have to use in every single one of these things is ultimately source provenance. That just because you see a picture on the internet doesn't mean it ain't photoshopped, and you need to be thinking about whether or not you need to be skeptical about it. Acoustic waves and documents can be faked. So does that mean you believe nothing? You'll reject everything? Well, sorry, you can't have a culture that runs that way. So you've got to literally figure out how to make sense out of an environment where some people will still try to bullshit you, and they're just having more clever tools to do it with.
Yeah, wait. So, RJ, are you telling us and advising us that we shouldn't believe everything we read on the internet?
Yeah, you shouldn't even believe me, as oracular as I am. And that's why I make a point of putting up those sources of matter. This is something that, can you imagine where everybody gets held to that account, to where they say, okay, you've made this wonderful statement, Senator X. Do you have any evidence for it? Oh, you don't have any evidence for it? Then why are we paying attention to you? In fact, why do we vote for you? In fact, we should ask you before you get elected about that. And we shouldn't vote for you if you don't know how to do that.
And we have to be more and more critical of the evidence, because if we're all three of us are part of movie night. I have posted screenshots as evidence.
You mean those aren't all real?
Those aren't all real. I would add one word in that sentence. Those aren't at all real.
Yeah, a little more qualifications. In fact, I was just having a thing today where I was listening to a video person, and they were having a discussion about Bible contradictions, and somebody brought up a point and they meant it to be serious, because they said it's true, and it was about supposedly when Galileo looked through his telescope and saw the rings of Saturn, that when they contacted the Vatican Library, a guy there said, no, actually, that's the foreskin of Jesus that was cast up into the heavens. And I said, yeah, that's true. Somebody believed that. Well, I thought, gee, that's amazing and interesting and incredibly stupid if true. So I decided to search it out to find out, get a source on it. And it turns out it was said by somebody in the 19th century about this guy from the 17th century, and no one's been able to find the source involved. They've never been able to verify it. And so even though it was from theoretically our side, nonetheless, I put in some comments on that no, that's something that wasn't really true.
Yeah.
And
so that's basically you saying that Rule 34 exists in creationism.
Yeah. I was actually going to say, is that God trying to make Saturn the dick of all jokes?
Well, in fact, it related to a long tradition. There was a bunch of different people in the Middle Ages that had the foreskin of Jesus in their relic collection. There was enough foreskins out there to coat an army.
And they're still here. The Catholic Church, I'm not exactly sure of the number, but I think has 11 or 19 foreskins of Jesus. So this moves.
He shed them like trilobite shells.
No, he must have had axolotl genes. Where
there we go. A whole new version of Christianity, and you could easily imagine how, if you didn't have heretic hunting there, where notions like that could easily develop. But anyway, so my take-home point, as always, is don't trust things, but you verify and you learn, and you gradually build up things where you can check stuff out, like I did with Rupi and Sanford, that I can tell you that when I read a source where it turns out the quote they gave literally doesn't exist, that's a dead giveaway that they are sloppy scholars, and that therefore that raises the probability that they're not very good at making arguments, and you should be suspicious of them. Hear that, Mr. Brown, from the video. Anyway, we'll thank you very much for the show, and as Brian Stevens says, well, God just had a lot of dicks, and and thank you for today. I hope more of you will be looking at the links in the description and reading up on all that for Science Geekdom. They're fascinating papers, open access, and you'll learn stuff and have more ammunition to throw at the stupid people. Well, thank you very much, Cap and Peter, or as they would say to you, Cap, in the thing, time to boot you.
Yeah.